On this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, the Memphis Grizzlies got mauled in Chicago by the Bulls. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the return, quote unquote, of Steven Adams. Good to see him back on the bench for the Grizzlies. How long will he be in Memphis? And we're going to preview tonight's game for the Grizzlies in Toronto against the Raptors. All that and more on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Lock in with me.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, flying solo on this episode. No DeMichael Cole, the commercial appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for that publication. But you got me. You've got Joe Mullinax, who's been covering the Grizzlies for over a decade now in a variety of spots. Excited to be back with you. I hope you checked out our previous episode. Him and Rafael Barlow did a great job talking G.G. Jackson and all of the positive things going on with the Grizzlies in terms of young talent. Some not so good things as well. And unfortunately, that reared its ugly head on Saturday in Chicago against the Bulls. We're going to lead off with that here momentarily. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Of course, here on Locked On Grizzlies, we are proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can also check us out on YouTube. I don't know if you've checked our YouTube subscriptions lately, but we are inching closer and closer. I think we're within less than 50 subscriptions now to get to 3,000 over on YouTube. DeMichael and I greatly appreciate everybody that's helped grow the show. Hopefully, you'll continue to spread the good news that is Locked On Grizzlies. That subscriber list will continue to grow, and we'll get over 3,000 this week. A lofty goal, but I think one that is possible for us, thanks in large part to you guys subscribing. So thank you for checking us out on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, all of those fun things. We are so glad to be part of your NBA experience, whether you're an everydayer that checks us out every time an episode drops, or if this is your first time coming through, whatever the case might be, wherever you fall on the content spectrum, we're glad you're with us. I was not on the last episode. DeMichael had a great conversation with Rafael Barlow. As I mentioned, if you didn't see it or hear it, you should definitely go back and listen or watch. Lots of good stuff. That led into the weekend, right? And the Grizzlies going to Chicago, playing the Chicago Bulls. And there was lots of fun stuff about that game going into it, right? The return of Steven Adams to the Grizzlies bench, which we'll talk more about later in the show. There were pictures of Joakim Noah, who obviously had a brief run as a member of the Memphis Grizzlies. They're hanging out with Jaren Jackson Jr. and Derrick Rose. Obviously, Joakim Noah, a major piece of the Chicago Bulls during the Derrick Rose era. But the biggest thing that stood out to me from that build up to that game was how much people thought that the team was in a position to at least compete, right? Because that had been what the team had been showing. The level of competitiveness, they weren't getting run out of gyms. They weren't in a position as of yet for all the reasons that it could be happening, right? I want to stress that. All the context in the world matters here when it comes to these Grizzlies and their current situation. They have lost more minutes to injury than any team in the National Basketball Association this year. So when we're excited about wins over the Golden State Warriors, and we're excited about hanging tough with arguably the best team in the Western Conference and the Minnesota Timberwolves, potentially the best team in the NBA, even though it was a 15-point loss, that bringing about good vibes is excusable given the circumstances. Going into the Chicago Bulls game, there were plenty of reasons for good vibes. Coming out of it, not as much. Not as much. That was not a good basketball game if you were a fan of the Memphis Grizzlies for a variety of reasons. First off, it was never really competitive. The Grizzlies never led at the end of any quarter. They were down by 10 at the half. They only scored 17 points in the first quarter. So while it was a 4-point game, technically Memphis was in it. There's nothing about that first quarter, aside from the Bulls themselves also starting slow, that made you think that Memphis was actually in the contest, right? And it progressed that way throughout the game. And you had continued poor efforts from players like Zaire Williams, who, goodness gracious, I tweeted out or posted, whatever you want to call it, on X over the weekend coming out of that game. 23 players have a total plus minus of minus 200 or worse this season. The player in the NBA who has the fewest minutes played of that group is Zaire Williams. So you can make a legitimate argument, statistical argument, that Zaire Williams is the worst basketball player this season in the National Basketball Association. Are there other ways to explain that? Maybe. Is plus minus the best stat to measure player contributions? No, not always. But as with any stat, the larger the sample, the more reliable you can consider it. And Zaire has played in a lot of these games for the Memphis Grizzlies this season. Now, in this particular contest, he wasn't alone in his struggles, right? G.G. Jackson, the aforementioned G.G. Jackson. And goodness gracious, don't yell at me in the comments. He's 19 years old. I'm just happy he's playing given the circumstances. It wasn't Gigi's best game. He wasn't able to get his shot off as consistently. Defensively, he struggled. A lot of times playing alongside Zaire, that's not the best combination right now. In terms of theory, in terms of size and young talent, maybe it's enticing. And Taylor Jenkins, the head coach of the Grizzlies, doesn't have a ton of other options. But it wasn't the best pairing. It wasn't the best run for Gigi. But again, he's 19 years old. I'm not worried about G.G. Jackson. I'm excited about his talent. He's developing. Zaire Williams has had a heck of a lot more opportunity, right? John Conchar has had a heck of a lot more opportunity. He played 27 minutes and scored 2 points as a starter. That's atrocious. That's atrocious. That is not helping the cause. Santi Aldama continues to struggle. 1 for 5 from 3. 8 rebounds plus. John Conchar, 6 assists plus. But you got to be able to score. Jaren Jackson Jr. scores 26 points in this game on 18 shots, 9 for 9 from the free throw line, 6 rebounds, 5 assists. He's the only guy Memphis has got. They're relying on guys like David Roddy to be far more than they should be. 32 minutes played for David Roddy. On a good basketball team, that doesn't happen. Jacob Gilyard, 16 minutes. On a good basketball team, that doesn't happen. Jackson and Gilyard and Scottie Pippen Jr. are the 3 two-way players for the Memphis Grizzlies right now. And those guys logged significant minutes. So I don't want to beat a dead horse, but a lot of the conversations coming out of games and going into games, it's going to be understanding the reality of the circumstances of this team. They don't have the guys to compete right now. They just don't. Luke Kennard is realistically their second best player. Luke Kennard, 4 for 7 from 3, 14 points. I'm not trying to take shots at Luke Kennard. He's in the rotation when this team is healthy and competitive. But for him to be their second best player tells you all you need to know. And you can make an argument he's not their second best player. It's Vince Williams Jr., who was on a 2-way contract to start the season, playing 5 minutes against the Lakers back when Marcus Smart and Luke Kennard had their first injury bouts this season during the John Morant suspension. So, dear listener, dear viewer, hear me out here, okay? You want them to compete. You want them to show effort. You want to see growth. I think you consider to see that with Vince Williams Jr. That was a positive coming out of the Bulls game. 14 points, 5 rebounds, 2 assists. There's no reason, that Vince Williams Jr. can't do something like that just about every night for the Memphis Grizzlies. And he's a part of the core, as DeMichael and I have talked about here, there, and everywhere on Locked On Grizzlies. But using this time to figure out what you have in a Zaire, what you have in a John Conchar, you may already have that answer. You might tell me in the comments that you know Zaire Williams stinks. You know what? I think I agree with you. I've said that before. But you've got time leading into this trade deadline to try to figure that out. Because whether it's now or whether it's this summer, there has to be some sort of significant move involving multiple pieces to make this team what it needs to be going into a very consequential season that will be the 2024-2025 campaign, when we assume that Ja Morant, Brandon Clark, Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart, all these guys are healthy. And the name that I left off of that list just now, Steven Adams, also returns. Now, Steven Adams kind of returned in Chicago. He was back on the bench. People have been asking why Steven Adams hadn't been there. We'll talk about why he was gone, his return, and how long Steven Adams figures to be in Memphis, because he's one of those guys who an expiring contract going into next season, maybe he makes sense as a salary matcher alongside a young player and draft picks to get an upgrade for the Grizzlies going into this trade deadline, thinking about next season. We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by LinkedIn. At the start of the new year, every small business owner is asking themselves the same question. What is one move that I can make that'll take my business to the next level in 2024? LinkedIn Jobs knows that your success all depends on the team that you surround yourself with. That's why LinkedIn Jobs has created the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. It has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals with a B, which makes it the best place to hire. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Achieving goals in 2024 should be on everybody's mind this time of year. The right team member can help you do just that. It is why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we are talking Steven Adams, his inglorious return, and how long he's going to be in Memphis. Hopefully for a while, but, it's kind of a weird time in Memphis. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax. No to Michael Cole on this episode. Hopefully you're enjoying yourself, staying warm wherever you are, talking Grizzlies basketball, as always, here on Locked On Grizzlies. We've left the mess that was the Chicago Bulls game in the past, at least for now. I do want to talk, before we get into tonight's game with the Raptors, about the situation with Steven Adams. And it's not necessarily a situation. It's more of a breath of fresh air, right? It was nice to see Steven Adams back in the fold, back in the mix, back on the bench with the Grizzlies in Chicago. Taylor Jenkins, the head coach of the Memphis Grizzlies, talked before the game about having Steven Adams back, having him on the bench, why Adams hadn't been around. The knee recovery was something that they wanted to take seriously, let him stay at home, really prioritize that. He's gotten to the point in his recovery where he's now able to travel, and that is why he's back with the team. And that's good news because the Grizzlies are going to need him healthy if they hope to have a successful 2024-2025 NBA season. We're at that stage now. If you're still thinking about this season, bless your heart, right? This season's about development. This season is about trying to figure out who fits here long-term. That all holds value and is more than enough reason to continue to watch the games, continue to seek out Grizzlies content like Locked On Grizzlies, right? That's perfectly fine. But in terms of the play-in, playoffs, we're talking about playoffs? You kidding me? Playoffs? I'm just trying to win a game. I'm just trying to see this team compete. Without Steven Adams on the floor, that gets a heck of a lot harder to do. So it's good to see him progressing in his recovery. But it's also important to understand that the contract of Steven Adams is written in such a way, is expiring in such a way this coming season. 2024-2025 is the last year of that contract. Coming off of a pretty significant surgery that should clean everything up. You've heard our co-host Michael Cole talk about that. The anticipation is Steven Adams will be ready to go come training camp this fall. Cool. A good, healthy Steven Adams helps this Grizzlies team immensely. Phenomenal rebounder, tremendous screener. It'd be great to have that guy back, see what he can do on that healthy knee, maybe sign him to another extension because he partners nicely with Jaren, creates great space for Ja and Bane. Wonderful addition. Even if Adams becomes a reserve big, he is a helpful tool on a good basketball team, which is what the Grizzlies are when they're healthy, and they aspire to be a great team. Steven Adams can help them get there, right? But can Steven Adams help them get there in another way? Can that contract paired with a Santi Aldama, a Zaire Williams, a couple of second or first round picks help in terms of getting some sort of an upgrade at that position long-term if you are concerned about the long-term well-being of Steven Adams? The oldest player on the roster, or one of the oldest players on the roster, Derrick Rose exists now. One of the oldest players on the roster in Steven Adams. If you are worried about that knee, if you're worried about him being able to be what he was for the Grizzlies, which I'm not necessarily, right? Because his game was never one that was above the rim. It's good to see Brandon Clark dunking and doing those things again. It suggests he's closer to a return than maybe I and others thought possible. Maybe the All-Star break-ish into March is realistic for Brandon Clark. But I'm much more concerned about the Achilles tear for Brandon Clark than I am the PCL repair for Steven Adams. Because Brandon Clark's game is not exclusively, but very heavily reliant on his leap ability, his ability to bounce and then bounce again off the floor, his explosiveness off the floor and at the rim. A lot of what Clark does well is built off of a lot of what your Achilles does for your leg. Makes me nervous. Steven Adams can be elite at being big and strong and positioning himself for rebounds and screening. He could do all that even on a knee that isn't quite what it once was. So if I had to choose, and this might be a hot take, you know how I'm good for those every once in a while. If I had to choose, I would probably stick with Adams opposed to Clark. And I also think Clark, similar to Z, like we talked about last week, if you caught my last episode that I was on, Zaire compared to Roddy, Clark compared to Adams. Zaire has a higher ceiling. Clark arguably does too. So if you're more of a believer in modern medicine than I am, and you think Clark's going to be fine, then obviously you hold on to BC. And I think that Jackson and Morant and Bane would rather Brandon Clark stick around in the long term as well. And the Grizzlies have a long-term extension with him. So I do believe that Brandon will be here. But what about Adams, the expiring contract, the nature of the injury, the age question? If you could take Steven Adams, Zaire Williams, and a first-round pick and send that to the Orlando Magic for, say, Wendell Carter Jr., and this is from Brent Usher on Twitter. Over the last 4 games since returning from a 5-game absence, Wendell Carter Jr., 24 years old, he's 6'10", a little bit shorter than a little bit shorter than Jaren, is averaging 19.3 points on 79.2% true shooting percentage with 7 rebounds and a plus 37 total plus minus. Orlando has a bevy of bigs, right? Wendell Carter Jr. has been the odd man out for a while in that rotation. If Orlando's listening to trades for that guy, and you have an expiring in Adams who can still help them as a reserve big next year, because again, he helps a good team be good. Zaire Williams is your upside swing on a Magic team that is still a year or so away from being a legitimate contender in the Eastern Conference. And you get another asset in a first-round pick to couple in a future trade or to use on another young talent. I think Orlando listens to that trade. I'm not saying it's a home run, yes. And for Memphis, do you address the center position long-term with somebody like Wendell Carter Jr. coming in? Now, DeMichael Cole has talked about Clint Capella from the Atlanta Hawks. That's cool. I'll listen on him. Andre Drummond had a very strong performance for the Bulls against the Grizzlies. The Grizzlies didn't really have a traditional center playing in that game, right? The starting 5 was Jaren Jackson Jr. Xavier Tillman didn't play against the Bulls. He hopefully will play against the Raptors. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But you're at a stage with this Grizzlies team where you're trying to figure out long-term pieces. I am comfortable saying Zaire Williams is not a long-term piece. John Conchar, not a long-term piece. If you want to keep John Conchar because he's cheap, in air quotes, at the end of the bench, I can hear that argument. But he's not somebody that's in the rotation. Zaire Williams probably is not somebody that's in the rotation. David Roddy is a tweener. If you want to argue against him, I'll listen to that argument. Jake LaRavia, probably not in the rotation. So we talked about that consolidation trade. If they're not good for the Grizzlies, it's not like the other 29 NBA teams are going to clamor to bring these guys in. But the idea of a second draft, somebody getting a second chance in a new city and a new team and a new organization, that's very real. And somebody like Zaire Williams could benefit from that. Steven Adams doesn't hurt Orlando in the long term and they get another asset. To me, that makes sense for Wendell Carter Jr. Maybe you're not a WCJ fan. Maybe you want somebody else. Maybe you think the Grizzlies still need another wing, which, by the way, you're probably right. Maybe you want Memphis to wait until the offseason to make this kind of a move. Talk to me in the comments. Let me know what you think. I am cool if they keep Steven Adams. I want to stress that. I don't want our New Zealanders, our Kiwis getting mad at me. I like Steven Adams a lot. I think he brings a lot to the table. I think Memphis needs him, if he's on the roster healthy, to be as good as they want to be. But that contract is enticing. Same thing with Luke Kennard. And you know how I feel about Luke if you've been following the show for a while. All options have to be on the table aside from Bane, Jackson Jr., and Morant, and to a lesser extent, Vince Williams Jr. now. All options are on the table in terms of trying to find ways to get this team ready to compete next year, because next year's a significant season. You'll continue to hear myself and DeMichael Cole talk about that. And then, of course, the season that is now here on Locked On Grizzlies as we continue to grind forward. Speaking of grinding forward, Memphis has a game tonight against the Toronto Raptors. We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. It is Locked On Sports Today, 24/7 covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus national shows that cover every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Betterhelp. We come to sports for escape, right? That's one of the goals of our focus with this show. But with BetterHelp, it's important to understand that you can still grow and get better as a person, right? That should also be a priority of ours in this new year. Don't get me wrong, you're crushing it, right? There's lots of things that you're doing well, but I know, I'm at least speaking for myself, there's still a lot of areas that I can learn and grow in, getting myself together a little bit better in some spots. Therapy can help you find your strengths so you can ditch the extreme resolutions and make changes that actually stick. If you're thinking about starting therapy, consider giving BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your very busy schedule. You fill out a brief questionnaire, you get matched with a licensed therapist, and you switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Celebrate the progress you've already made in this new year and continue to build upon that great foundation. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is also brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL playoffs continue. The conference championships are coming. The big game is on the way. There's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use, and there are so many different ways to bet. Live same-game parlays, new Explore tab bets, making a parlay in the Parlay Hub. That's the best way to find popular parlays, and so much more. Obviously, the NBA is in full swing, but the NFL season is reaching its conclusion. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup with FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. Tonight, the Memphis Grizzlies take on the Toronto Raptors. It's going to be an interesting contest for Memphis. Xavier Tillman, Sr., is questionable for the game, thankfully. Having a legitimate center, no offense to Jaren Jackson Jr., should help in the battle of the bigs, Jacob Poeltl and others that should be in the mix for Toronto. No injured players, of course, for the Toronto Raptors. It seems like the Grizzlies are the ones dealing with the injury bug the most, and the minutes per game lost due to injury numbers back that up. The Raptors are struggling, much like Memphis. Both teams were 1-4 in their last 5 games. Both teams got blown out recently, their most recent losses. The Knicks destroyed the Raptors by 26 on the same night that the Bulls blew out the Memphis Grizzlies. So both teams coming off tough losses, both teams cooling out a little bit. Both teams with similar records, 16-27 Toronto Raptors, 15-27 Memphis Grizzlies. So what's the difference in this game? What is the difference in terms of why Toronto is favored by 6.5 points and Memphis is the underdog? Well, for one thing, Toronto is at home. The Raptors are close to 500 as a home basketball team, 10-11. The Memphis Grizzlies, 11-12 on the road, but still Memphis is the road team, so it makes sense that the Raptors with a decent home record would be favored. The reason that number is multiple possessions and not just one is the current state of the Memphis Grizzlies. Desmond Bane leads the team in points scored per game, obviously out. Leads the team in assists per game, obviously out. Rebounds was Bismack Biyombo for the Memphis Grizzlies in terms of rebounds per game. He's not even on the team anymore. Meanwhile, you've got Scotty Barnes, Dennis Schroeder leading this Raptors team in points, rebounds, and assists. Emmanuel Quickley, obviously now a member of this Raptors roster. RJ Barrett as well, coming out of the OG Anunoby trade with the Knicks. Pascal Siakam, of course, moved along to the Indiana Pacers recently as well. That means that you've got new members of the Pacers of the Raptors, like Bruce Brown, very solid wing defender, probably not long for the Raptors world. That's been talked about a lot. Brown potentially being traded to other teams in the lead up to the trade deadline. that'll be interesting to see how it all plays out, right? Bruce Brown, a very talented player. Does he make sense on the rebuilding Raptors? And the Raptors are most certainly rebuilding at this stage of their process. But again, within their rebuild, right, within what Toronto is dealing with, similar to the Grizzlies, right? Toronto not really actively seeking out victories, nor are the Memphis Grizzlies at this stage. But the major difference is health, okay? And that's going to be part of these previews, part of the reality for this Grizzlies team moving forward. Scotty Barnes, the key to the Toronto Raptors rebuild, very healthy, getting 30-plus minutes a game. Gary Trent Jr., maybe not a part of the rebuild. Maybe he gets traded soon, but he's still a pretty good basketball player. We mentioned RJ Barrett and Quickly earlier. You've got Thaddeus Young still getting run for the Raptors. You've got Bruce Brown, Dennis Schroeder, the two lead guys off the bench right now for Toronto. They have more actual NBA players, if I'm just being real with you on this Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, guys that other teams will value. I mentioned earlier in the show that Luke Kennard is the second best player on the Memphis Grizzlies right now. If you want to say Vince Williams Jr., I'll hear that. At worst, Luke Kennard's the third best player on the Memphis Grizzlies right now. The third best player on the Toronto Raptors right now is probably Bruce Brown, right? Maybe RJ Barrett if you really like Bruce Brown. Maybe Emmanuel Quickly. You get the point that I'm making, right? Memphis just does not have enough actual NBA talent in a position to compete to put this team as a favorite in just about any game they play moving forward. And that hurts to say out loud, but listen to the injury report. Assume Tillman plays. He's questionable. Usually questionable designations mean they're going to give it a go for the Grizzlies. Doesn't mean it's a guarantee, but he'll try to play. So let's assume he's on the court. Steven Adams, Desmond Bane, Brandon Clark, Jake LaRavia, John Morant, Derrick Rose, Marcus Smart. John Morant, Marcus Smart, Desmond Bane, Brandon Clark, Steven Adams is a playoff starting five. That's also over $100 million in salary that is on injured reserve. The reality of the situation is the Memphis Grizzlies are simply not built to compete right now. You want to see continued growth from Jaren Jackson Jr. You want to keep letting him grow and feel the development that comes with being in a position that you are maybe not as comfortable in, being that lead option. You want him to continue to have that opportunity. You want Zaire Williams and John Conchar to build up trade value, show competency, really lean into look at what happens when I have the opportunity to play. Watch me grow and flourish somewhere else, hopefully, right? There's still value in this. You want to see Vince Williams Jr. because he's going to be on this team. I'm confident in saying that, barring some major trade, Vince Williams Jr. is going to be on this Grizzlies team opening night back when they're trying to be good again. Whether Steven Adams is on the roster or not, hopefully he is, but it's possible there's a move made. That time is coming, and you have to find out who's going to be there beyond Jaren and beyond Vince Williams Jr. Bane and Morant will be there, but they're not there right now. So even though the Grizzlies are likely going to lose this game, you hope they compete first and foremost. If they get blown out each and every game, that's when you start asking about Taylor Jenkins. He doesn't have the horses right now, man. Doesn't have the horses to win. But if they get blown out by 30 over the next several games, they lose to the Raptors, they lose to the Heat, they lose to the Magic, 30 plus, we can start having that Jenkins conversation again. If they're fighting and competing, I'm good. Execution is going to be a challenge beyond the names that I mentioned in Jaren and Vince. Who finds their footing, who maximizes the opportunity, who continues to show growth in adverse circumstances and situations. That's what you watch this game for tonight. And hopefully on our next episode of Locked On Grizzlies, we're talking about positive examples of that. Remember that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube. Subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. The next time that we're here on Locked On Grizzlies, we'll talk Grizzlies-Raptors, how things went, hopefully well in some spaces. Probably not as well in others. We haven't talked about John Morant being in the top 10 in the backcourt voting for the All-Star game among fans, even though he's only played, 9 or 10 games this season, the suspension, all these reasons, now the injury for Ja to potentially lose some momentum. Maybe we check in with the culture side, right? How he's still seen pretty highly by fans, the shoes selling, all those sorts of things. We can talk more about Ja and look ahead to an East Coast run for the Grizzlies. Again, Miami, Orlando, Indiana over the next few games. Maybe check the lay of the land in the Eastern Conference and the top of the West as well and see how there's been some changing of the guard in terms of who the best teams in the NBA are, especially out West. Lots of fun things to discuss this coming episode and the entire week here on Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you so much for liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing. Again, we're so close to 3,000 subscribers on YouTube. Help us get over that line. DeMichael and I would much appreciate it. Make sure that you're an everydayer coming each and every time that Locked On Grizzlies drops a new episode. Tell your friends, tell your family. Check out Joe and DeMichael over on Locked On Grizzlies. Hopefully, as we build the show, you won't be disappointed for giving that kind recommendation. Thank you so much for being here with me on this episode of the show. Until next time, stay locked in. Enjoy Grizzlies Raptors. Stay safe wherever you're at. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, and most of all, lock into Locked On Grizzlies.